Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about the Ruy Lopez after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and more specifically today we're going to be talking about the most insane counterattack that black can possibly play against you. Basically deciding to play a King's Gambit in reverse against your Ruy Lopez. We're talking about the Schliemann defense. We're talking about the move pawn to f5. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So this opening is simultaneously an opening that has kind of died out, mostly because of the computer era of chess. Now that we have computers that can analyze the game a lot more accurately, people have kind of started shying away from stuff like this, where people can just kind of have a ton of computer preparation and just kind of get a huge advantage with white. And it is also the subject of one of my most disliked lines in the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer. There's a scene where Josh Waitzkin is playing against one of the park hustlers, and he says, "Well, what's that defense you just learned?" He says, "Oh, it's called the Schliemann defense." And then the park hustler says, "Oh, well, they're not teaching you how to win; they're teaching you how not to lose," which makes zero sense because the Schliemann is this ridiculously aggressive opening. If you're playing the Schliemann as black, you're obviously playing to win. You're not playing not to lose. If you're playing not to lose, it would be like a Berlin or something boring. The Schliemann is the exact opposite of that. So the line just didn't fit with the actual opening that they were showing. So anyways, how do we meet this with white, and why is the Schliemann just kind of like borderline unsound? Well, for starters, as you can see, it's this really aggressive attempt at going after white's center, but of course it's black that's doing it, so he's already down a tempo. So what should white do? Well, white should just develop a piece. I think knight c3, just the most natural move. We almost shouldn't consider any other move. We should just develop a new piece, defend our center, and just say, look, we've got 3 pieces out, you've only got 1, and you're offering to open the position for us. Great, we're definitely in favor of all this. Okay, so here, you kind of just got to know your theory. I got into a debate years ago kind of about this opening. I used to say that, the Schliemann defense, it's one of those openings as white where you really just can't play it safe. You just have to know the theory, and you just have to play some of these super sharp lines very accurately and just play them correctly. Get your advantage and just call it a day. And somebody, of course, argued. They said, no, there's always a safe cash out in every single line. And I'm going to get to that in a second, and kind of why I disagree and still disagree to this day. But anyway, so the main sort of move here is just like f takes e4, but there's also kind of 2 secondary moves. There's knight f6 and there's knight d4. So let's just kind of cover knight d4. Probably just bishop c4 is just easy advantage for white. Again, we have a King's Gambit reversed where black has moved the same piece twice and played f5. This just really can't be sound, but we do have a game here that we're following. We have c6, we have castles kingside, we have pawn to d6, we have e takes f5, bishop takes f5, knight d4, e takes d4, rook e1 check, king d7, knight e2, queen f6, and then simply knight g3 is just considered slight edge white. And this actually doesn't just follow one game, it follows a couple different games. But the computer actually says major advantage white, so I'm being a little bit generous by saying just slight edge white. So white has the better pawn structure, white has more development, etc. But just moving forward from here, you should have some sort of major advantage. So going back all the way back here, let's just back up a little bit more. We have this possibility, we have knight d4. Instead of knight d4, there's also this possibility of knight f6. So yeah, knight d4, bishop c4 should just be somewhere between slight edge to major advantage white just plays a few natural moves. So we have this other move, knight f6, and again, I'm just kind of going to recommend the one move here. I mean, there is more than one move. There's like, e captures f5 is certainly possible, but I just think, again, just holding the center, queen e2 is totally reasonable. And then we have f takes e4, knight takes e4, and now we have d5. So here's where life gets kind of interesting. I think what you should do is I think you should follow this game, Kamsky versus Lagarde, which continued knight f6. And I'm going to go kind of more into this line here in a second. In the old days, like back before we had computers, we used to think this move, knight takes e5, was good. And actually, the computers back then thought that knight takes e5 was good. I mean, back in the mid to late 90s, back when I was playing this kind of stuff with white. And actually, I had a really interesting game. It was one of my most interesting games back in the Minnesota Open back in, I think, 2002. I was playing the white pieces against a chess master named Mohamed Tabakovic. who was well known for playing wild and crazy stuff. And actually, one person that witnessed the game said he was really curious to see how the game between us would turn out, because up till that point, I don't think we'd ever played in a tournament game against each other before. And not a slow game anyway. And he said that he was confused by both of our styles, because every time he would watch us play, he thought that we were losing, but then somehow he would win. Then somehow we would win. And he was curious to see what the game looked like when we played each other. And he said, sure enough, he went up to the board and he was convinced that we were both losing. so he didn't know who was better, because the position was, of course, very wild. And after knight takes e4, knight takes e5, the position is very wild. But modern computers think the position is closer to equal than slight edge white, which is kind of interesting. But they do back up Tabakovic's move back in that game, which was d takes e4. And then the computers back then said that my next move was an error. And it said that queen c4 was better. And this just shows you how much computer analysis has improved. Now, modern computers say, no, 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 if you play queen c4 here, queen d5 is not any good. And that's what we thought. We thought queen d5, and we just thought queen d5, knight d5, knight c6, bishop d7, knight d4, castles, queen said, bishop d7, rook d7, knight e2, and white's up a pawn. That's what the computers thought back then. We're talking like Fritz 5, So it was considered a mistake that I missed this queen c4, which triple attacks c6 and threatens mate, seemingly forcing queen d5. Modern engines think queen d6 is simply advantage black. So modern engines just think queen c4 is kind of silly, and we can just play queen d6, and yeah, you don't actually have to block queen f7 check, apparently. It's not a huge threat. So modern engines think this is just advantage black and queen c4 is silly, and it actually prefers the move I played in the game, which was knight c6, which leads to an incredibly unclear position. And I'll just show that game because it was one of my better games, and if you do play the old knight takes e5 line, it's relevant. B takes c6 takes, bishop d7, I ripped here, and then I actually got rid of the central pawns. I played d3 and broke down the middle. He played bishop e7, takes, and then I played these series of checks just to grab the excess pawn on c7, basically just to loosen up his pieces. And then when I got castled safely, and this was the crux of the whole thing, is I had to time everything out to make sure I got castled safely. His king was super loose in the middle of the board, and his position, overall, it wasn't going to be defensible. Now, I had a couple quicker wins in here. I think I missed a couple of earlier opportunities to win the game with some earlier piece sacrifices, but eventually I did get there. Rook f6, king f6, queen d6 won the game, and this just final combination trapping the queen on a8. But I did end up winning that game, but again, just kind of going back to this whole continuation, probably not relevant to theory anymore. I mean, knight takes e5 it used to be an acceptable way to go. Knight f6 is probably just quite a bit better. And this is just following this game Kansky versus Lagarde, played back in Bale in 2021. Continued gf6, d4, e4, then just simply knight h4, threatening queen h5, of course. Queen e7, then simply castles, f5, g3, bishop g7, queen h5 check, queen f7 takes, and then simply c3, bishop to f6, we have knight g2, knight d8, bishop e2, knight e6, and then simply knight e3, attacks two pawns, and white has just an absolutely decisive advantage in this position, and Kamsky did go on to win. His opponent actually kind of went nuts and just tried to sacrifice some material back, and, Kamsky, of course, accepted, and then he went on to win the game from here. But it's just decisive advantage white, as soon as knight e3 gets played. So it seems like overall this position after the knight f6 move is going to be just major advantage white after knight f6, gf6, d4, e4, knight h4. So this is a much better path to go down than the path that I went down with this old line, knight takes e5. So it just kind of shows you how theory evolved over the years. So what other possibilities are there? Well, the main possibility in the Schliemann is just simply f takes e4, and then we have knight takes e4, and then we have d5. Now, d6 is also possible, but it basically completely loses. I found one game that was very quick. It was Kasparov versus Harnois, played in 1999, continued with d4, bishop d7, d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight e5, d takes e5, queen h5 check, king e7 check, and then just like, okay, look, black's getting mated, this is silly. So Kasparov just kind of mated him 1-0 on move 14. he's not like it's made in a few moves. You don't really need to calculate it or just win of a queen or something. It's over. Okay, so d6 is really silly. I mean, just d4 is obviously some sort of major to decisive advantage white. So the whole point of this is, fe4, knight e4, we're going to play d5, kick in the middle, and then, yeah, we got to get aggressive. We got to play knight takes e5. Now, this comes back to that debate that I was talking about years ago where we were talking about, does white have a safe option in the Schliemann? And I don't think so, because black is trying to take the center of the board. And the only thing that you could do is you could let him. And if you let him, that's not remotely safe. I mean, you can play knight g3 and not go into the complications. And at first, the engine just says, okay, this is just slight edge white. But we got this game that was played between Anatoly Karpov, probably about the safest player you can think of, and Joel Lautier, that Anatoly Karpov did go on to win back in 1994. Where Anatoly Karpov played knight g3. And, of course, we have this continuation, bishop g4, h3, bishop f3, queen f3, and, so far so good. Then we have knight f6, and then after just this one little mistake, which just looks like the most natural move in the world, after castle's kingside, Lautier was completely equal after bishop d6, and, of course, Karpov then just had to go about the process of winning the game all over again. As a matter of fact, the only way for Karpov to keep the advantage that he has out of the opening, which is only a very slight advantage due to the fact that he has a development lead, which is compensating for the fact that he has no center, because black has the better center here. Also the fact that white has the bishop pair. He had to continue playing very aggressively. He had to play knight h5. And this is the only move that the engine gives is still advantage white. And then after e4, he has to, throw his queen on f5. And if this looks safe to you, if you think you can figure this all out from here, go ahead and play it. But honestly, I would prep this about, 10 or 12 moves deeper, because it's just... all my pieces are floating and I have no center. But according to the engine, this is somewhere between, this is like between slight and major advantage white. So this is still apparently okay. But in my mind, this is not a safe alternative to the main line, which is supposed to be somewhere between major to decisive advantage white if you play it correctly. So the main line just basically starts with knight takes e5. Then we have d takes e4. And now we just have knight takes c6. So now there's two moves that black can try here in the main line. He basically needs to attack the bishop on c4 with either queen d5 or queen to g5. So he needs to either play queen g5 here, or he needs to play queen d5 here. So we'll go over queen d5 first. Now, when queen d5 gets played, the first thing we need to do is we need to play c4. It's important to note that we're attacking the queen and defending the bishop, and this becomes relevant later. A good rule of thumb is if the bishop is defended by a pawn, then the move knight takes a7 is on. And that actually rhymes. Okay, but it's a good rule, okay? You can pull off knight takes a7 if the bishop is defended by a pawn. So there's this very obvious looking tactic as soon as you play c4, when the queen retreats to d6, where you can play knight takes a7. And in this case, it's completely sound. The point being that if they play c6, when you play knight to c8, you are hitting that queen on c6. So that knight is kind of backwards attacking that queen on c6. Now, what's very interesting is it's important that this bishop is at least temporarily held, and it's actually also very important that this d pawn has not moved. So there's no weird random check that hits the king. But even if there was, even if the d pawn had moved in this case, if there was a random check that hit the king, you would be able to block with tempo. You would be able to play bishop d2, and that bishop on b5 is not, in fact, hanging. So in this case, as soon as the knight gets captured, which is pretty much obligatory, for example, if queen b4, it hits air, so you just play knight b6, then you're up a whole piece. So basically we have rook c8, and then just bishop a4 should just be decisive advantage white. White has an extra pawn in the position, and is just doing quite well. Actually, I think it's an extra, what do we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 versus 1, 2, 3, 4. It's an extra 2 pawns in the position. So white is doing quite well. So that's, if queen d6, we just play knight to a7, and this should be basically decisive advantage. This should just be decisive advantage white. So knight a7 is fine. Okay, so going back, what about this other move? What about queen to g5? So this is probably the more serious move that we have to worry about, is this queen to g5. So here we should play queen e2, which defends our bishop on the b5 square, but also it kind of starts to x-ray defend our pawn on g2. And this is actually pretty critical, because they're going to spend a move to kind of defend this pawn on e4. And it's somewhat important to note that they still kind of have issues. They don't want this knight to move with some sort of serious threat or serious tempo. And what I mean by that is if black were to try something like capturing on g2 right now, when we start conducting our counterattack with, say, queen to h5, pawn to g6, queen e5, bishop e7, that knight will actually take that bishop with check and have a winning position. Of course, we didn't have time to play queen h8 because black is also threatening to take a rook. So this means that black doesn't have time to take on g2, and that's kind of the main thing. So the correct move here is apparently something like knight f6, and then we spend a move to defend that g2 pawn. We play pawn to f4, which x-ray defends that pawn. This pawn can't capture because the pawn is pinned to the king, so the queen is going to have to capture the pawn, and then we're going to have pawn to d4. So this was always kind of one of my favorite maneuvers. We protect our g2 pawn with the f4 pawn sacrifice, tempoing the queen, and then we play d4, hitting that queen. And that also guards the e5 square for our knight if we decide to retreat our knight to that e5 square in a move. So here we have queen d6, and now we play knight e5 check. And this is really important. Remember what I said earlier. If that bishop is not defended on b5, we don't take on a7. So it's not safe to take this pawn. Why is it not safe to take this pawn here? Well, if we play knight takes a7 here, it's kind of a long tactic, but it is important to note. We have pawn to c6, knight takes c8, it hits the queen on d6, so it looks the same, except that queen moves with check. And that bishop on b5 is not held by a pawn. So it's not anchored, it's not held by a pawn on c4. So now after c3 we exchange queens, and you think, well, no big deal, I'm still up a couple of pawns here, I'm doing really good. So the knight retreats to b6 and then rook a6, and guess what? Your knight on b6 has nowhere to go, you're down a whole piece. This is actually decisive advantage black. This is kind of just a well-known trap within the theory that a lot of people have fallen for. If you play the mainline theory, you might fall for this at least once, even if you know it, because it just looks so tempting to play this move knight takes a7, and it is just so absolutely wrong. But if you don't have a pawn on c4, you're not safe to take on a7. That's basically all you have to remember. So knight takes e5, and this should just be advantage white after knight e5. So we have knight e5, pawn c6, and then we have bishop to c4. And essentially we're following this game Karyakin versus Nespanyu that was played back in 2011, where Karyakin won with the white pieces. That game continued bishop e6, pawn to c3, bishop c4, queen d5, queen b3, bishop d6, queen takes b7. This position is obviously just some sort of advantage white. It's a little bit of a mess, but white's just doing a little bit better here. I mean, the game continued castles, takes. White just has to consolidate. And actually, the game was a little bit of a mess. So white had some trouble getting his king out of the middle of the board. As you can see, like after knight g4, it's kind of difficult to get the king out of the middle, but it's just, sometimes you just have to pay a price for being up a couple of pawns in an endgame. He gave some of the material back right away, and black made white's life uncomfortable, but eventually white was able to consolidate from here. Even here, it's still, I'm going to say it again, it's a little bit of a mess, but it's worth 2 pawns. So, I mean, if it's worth a couple of pawns to suffer a little bit, and eventually have a winning rook and pawn endgame. And eventually, Karyakin did win the rook and pawn endgame against Nespanyu. This was played back in 2011. So overall, this position should be considered somewhere between slight edge to major advantage white. Just kind of to review that variation, what we do is we play queen a2, x-ray defend the pawn, and then after knight f6 we have f4, d4, the knight retreats to e5, and then we basically just hold everything, and we take some stuff, and we suffer, and we try to win. But right now, the theory just basically holds. If you know all of your engine analysis, like everything I just showed in this video, white is holding somewhere between a major advantage to a decisive advantage in pretty much every single position, which is one of the reasons that you don't really see the Schliemann played a whole lot. At the very highest levels, especially when people have slow time controls, they're going to have this preparation in their prep if they play the Ruy Lopez. And that's why, for the most part, we're just seeing, Marshals and Berlins and anti-Marshals and anti-Berlins. That's kind of what we see in modern practice all the time. Well, but anyways, this is how you meet the Schliemann variation. This is the modern theory on it, and this is how you get some sort of advantage with the white pieces. So now you know. So now if you do face the Schliemann, you will be well prepared. Anyways, hope you found this video helpful. Hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.